This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to an immersive journey into the life and legacy of the man who reshaped human history, the historical Abraham. In this narration, we travel from the bustling streets of ancient Mesopotamia to the rugged highlands of Canaan, bridging the gap between sacred tradition and archaeological discovery. We will explore the radical birth of monotheism, the visceral reality of ancient covenants, and the enduring impact of a figure revered by billions. Join us as we sift through the dust of time to uncover the Father of Nations. Chapter 1: The Call of the Wanderer and the Birth of Monotheism. The story of the man who would become the father of three world religions begins in a world that was already ancient by the time he was born. This figure, originally named Abram, was the 10th generation from Noah and a direct descendant of Shem, the son who carried the spiritual mantle after the Great Flood. Born to Terah and his wife Machpelah, Abram entered history in the city of Ur of the Chaldees, a bustling metropolis in Mesopotamia. Regardless of its exact coordinates, Ur was a thriving center of the Middle Bronze Age, a city of material wealth where the skyline was dominated by a massive ziggurat dedicated to Nana, the moon god. Abram was born into a culture deeply committed to a vast pantheon of deities. His father, Terah, was said to be not just a worshipper of idols, but a merchant and maker of them. In this cultural context, an idol was the physical manifestation of a god that protected the household and the city. For a young man in such a society, to question these gods was a radical subversion of the entire social and economic order. One tradition suggests that Abram did not arrive at his convictions in a vacuum. Rather, he is said to have spent 39 years in the house of Noah and Shem, learning the ancient knowledge of the Creator that had been preserved since the days of the flood. This apprenticeship provided the foundation for his intellectual and spiritual awakening. One famous anecdote tells of a young Abram being left alone to mind his father's idol shop. Growing increasingly skeptical of the silent wooden figures, he took a hammer and smashed every idol in the room except for the largest one. When Terah returned and demanded an explanation for the destruction of his livelihood, Abram calmly placed the hammer in the hand of the surviving giant idol and claimed that the statues had gotten into a fight over an offering of flour, and the big one had emerged victorious. When Terah shouted that such a thing was impossible because the idols had no life or power, Abram famously replied by asking why then they were worthy of worship at all. Abram began to observe the heavens with a logic that defied his contemporaries. While his neighbors saw the sun, the moon, and the stars as independent gods to be appeased, Abram noticed that the stars faded when the moon appeared, and the moon disappeared when the sun rose, and even the sun set in the evening. He concluded that none of these changing, fleeting lights could be the ultimate power. Instead, there must be one unseen creator who directed the entire sphere. This realization was the birth of monotheism in a world buried under 1,000 years of paganism. Such defiance did not go unnoticed. Tradition links Abram's early years to a confrontation with King Nimrod, the first great tyrant mentioned in ancient records. Nimrod, who had proclaimed himself a god, viewed Abram's teaching of a single higher power as a direct threat to his throne. The legend tells of Abram being cast into a fiery furnace as punishment for his heresy, only to walk out of the flames completely unscathed. This miraculous survival reportedly led to his first group of followers and prompted his family to begin their first great migration. Terah took Abram, his wife Sarai, and his nephew Lot, and departed Ur with the intention of reaching the land of Canaan. However, they stopped and settled in the city of Haran, located in what is now southeastern Turkey.
It was here that Terah eventually died. It was also here, when Abram was 75 years old, that he received the divine call that would change the course of human history. The instruction was blunt. Abram was told to leave his country, his kindred, and his father's house to go to a land that would be shown to him. In the ancient world, leaving one's father's house meant walking away from legal protection and economic security to become a sojourner, a stranger at the mercy of potentially hostile city-states. Yet Abram obeyed. He took Sarai, Lot, and all the possessions and people they had acquired in Haran and set out for Canaan.
Upon entering Canaan, Abram stopped at Shechem and the hills between Bethel and Ai, building altars and calling upon the name of his God. This semi-nomadic lifestyle meant navigating the delicate politics of local tribes. When a severe famine struck the region, Abram was driven south to Egypt. Fearing for his life due to Sarai's beauty, he engaged in a ruse, identifying her as his sister, a claim based on her being his half-sister. While this led to Sarai being taken into Pharaoh's palace, the household was soon afflicted with plagues. Realizing the truth, Pharaoh returned Sarai and escorted Abram's household to the border, banishing them from Egypt. Returning to the region of Bethel and Ai, Abram found that his success had created a new problem. Both he and his nephew Lot had acquired such vast herds that the land could no longer support them both. In a move that demonstrated his character as a prince of peace, Abram offered Lot the first choice of the land. Lot chose the fertile plains of the Jordan River near Sodom, while Abram moved his tents to the oaks of Mamre in Hebron. This separation soon led to Abram's first recorded military action. A coalition of 4 powerful kings from the north, Amraphel of Shinar, Arioch of Elasar, Chedorlaomer of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, launched a campaign to suppress a rebellion in the Jordan Valley. Sodom was defeated, and Lot was taken captive. When news reached Abram, he assembled 318 trained men born in his own household. His military strategy was sophisticated. He pursued the invading army as far north as Dan, and, under the cover of night, divided his forces into multiple units to launch a surprise raid. He routed the 4 kings, chasing them past Damascus and recovering all the goods and captives. On his return, Abram was met by Melchizedek, the king of Salem and a priest of the Most High God. Melchizedek brought out bread and wine and blessed Abram. In response, Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. This meeting represented a unique moment of recognition between Abram and another practitioner of monotheism. While some view Melchizedek as a mysterious priest-king, other traditions identify him as Shem, Abram's own ancestor, or even a physical manifestation of the divine. Despite his victories, Abram remained childless. It was during this time that a vision was granted to him, promising that his offspring would be as numerous as the stars. A covenant was established, a unilateral divine commitment that guaranteed his lineage would eventually possess the land of Canaan. As the years passed without a child, Sarai provided her Egyptian servant Hagar to Abram. This led to the birth of Ishmael. However, the divine voice spoke again, clarifying that the covenant would be established through a son born to Sarai. It was at this time that their names were changed to Abraham and Sarah, and the rite of circumcision was instituted as a permanent sign in the flesh. Abram's role as an intercessor was further solidified when he learned of the impending judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. He engaged in a remarkable dialogue with the divine, bargaining for the lives of the people and asking if the city would be spared if even 10 righteous people were found there. The subsequent destruction of the cities by fire confirmed the depths of their corruption, as only Lot and his daughters were rescued. The cycle of doubt was finally broken when Sarah gave birth to a son. Abraham named the boy Isaac. By this time, Abraham had become known as the Hebrew. This term, or Ivri, likely stems from his ancestor Eber, but it also carries the etymological weight of the one who crossed over the Euphrates. Historically, it links him to a population that lived outside the established urban hierarchies of the time. Abraham had successfully crossed over from the world of his father to establish a new way of life based on faith in an unseen God and the pursuit of justice. He had achieved wealth, respect, and the miraculous gift of an heir. But as the patriarch settled into his later years in the land of Canaan, the historical question remains: can the world of this wandering chieftain be reconciled with what we find in the dust of the earth? How much of this radical shift to monotheism can be traced back to the actual cities and cultures of the second millennium BCE?
Chapter 2: The Archaeological Quest. To understand the historical reality of a figure as influential as Abram, we must move beyond the written word and look toward the physical remains left behind in the soil of the Middle East. For over a century, explorers and scientists have sifted through the dust of Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Israel, trying to find a tangible connection between the stories of the patriarchs and the actual history of the second millennium BCE. This quest has led to a fascinating tug-of-war between those who see the archaeological record as a confirmation of the ancient narratives and those who view the stories as a later literary creation. The journey into the past often begins at the site of ancient Ur. In the early 20th century, major excavations at Tel el-Mukayyar in southern Iraq revealed a city of staggering wealth and sophistication. Archaeologists discovered royal tombs filled with gold and lapis lazuli, but the intellectual remains were perhaps even more significant. Within the brick homes of the city, researchers found clay tablets that demonstrated a society of immense intellectual depth. These included musical notations and, most remarkably, geometrical calculations that utilized the principles of the Pythagorean theorem 1,500 years before Pythagoras was born. This discovery provided a vivid backdrop for the early life of Abram. It showed that if he originated in such a place, he was leaving behind a world of urban comfort and high science, not a primitive wasteland.
However, a significant debate exists regarding whether this southern Ur is truly the city of Abram's birth. Many researchers point toward a northern location in modern-day Turkey, specifically the city of Urfa. The reasoning for this northern preference lies in the geography of the subsequent travels described in the narratives. When Abram's servant was later sent to find a wife for Isaac, he was instructed to return to the land of his master's birth, yet he traveled to the region of Haran and northern Mesopotamia. This area, located in the Balich River basin, contains several sites with names that align with the patriarchal family tree. Assyrian texts from the first millennium BCE mention specific towns in this region named Tilshat-Turuchi, the ruin of Terah, and Nahuru, which corresponds to Nahor. Further context is provided by the Ebla tablets found in northern Syria, which confirm that the names and geography of the patriarchal era were deeply embedded in the local landscape of the second millennium BCE. Linguistic evidence also provides a concrete anchor for the historical plausibility of the narrative. The name Abram is not a unique literary invention. It is attested in the ancient records of Mari as Abiram and is specifically identified as being of Amorite origin. This aligns with the broader movement of Amorite-speaking peoples across the Fertile Crescent during the Middle Bronze Age, roughly between 2100 and 1550 BCE. This era was characterized by the movement of semi-nomadic clans who lived on the fringes of established city-states. These groups followed well-established trade and pasture routes and engaged in a complex relationship with urban centers. The social status of these people is reflected in the term Habiru or Apiru, which appears frequently in ancient Near Eastern texts. Rather than an ethnic designation, Habiru described a social class of outsiders, migrants, mercenaries, and laborers who lived outside the typical structure of settled civilization. This classification fits the description of the patriarchal lifestyle perfectly. These clans were not aimless wanderers, but participants in a recognized social and economic system that allowed them to move between the great powers of the age. Perhaps the most striking evidence for the historicity of this period comes from the discovery of thousands of clay tablets in the ancient cities of Mari and Nuzi. These documents provide a window into the legal and social customs that governed Abram's world. They reveal practices that seemed strange to later generations but were standard procedure in the second millennium BCE. For instance, newsy marriage contracts explicitly stated that if a wife was barren, she was required to provide her husband with a slave woman to ensure the continuation of the family line. Furthermore, these laws protected the resulting children, stating that the sons of the slave could not be easily cast out. This exact legal framework is mirrored in the tension between Sarah, Hagar, and Ishmael. The reluctance Abram felt when Sarah demanded Hagar's expulsion makes much more sense when viewed through the lens of these ancient legal obligations. The tablets also shed light on the peculiar instances where a patriarch would claim his wife was actually his sister. In the society of northern Mesopotamia during this period, the title of sister was sometimes a legal designation that granted a woman a higher social and protected status within a marriage. This cultural nuance provides a possible historical context for the episodes in Egypt and Gerar, suggesting that the stories were based on specific social customs that eventually faded from memory. The physical evidence of migration patterns also supports the narrative of travel between Canaan and Egypt. In a tomb at Beni Hassan in Egypt, a wall painting dating to around 1890 BCE depicts a group of 37 Asiatics arriving in the Nile Delta. They are shown with colorful garments, distinct hairstyles, and carrying weapons and musical instruments. This painting is a vivid contemporary snapshot of what a caravan led by a figure like Abram might have looked like as it sought relief from famine. Furthermore, in the land of Canaan itself, archaeologists have uncovered a deep well at Beersheba that aligns with the Middle and Late Bronze Age time frame, providing a physical anchor for the narratives of the patriarch's life in the southern desert. Even the controversial details of the narrative, such as the mention of camels, have been re-examined. While critics once argued that the presence of camels was an anachronism, archaeological work has uncovered camel bones in domestic settings and rock carvings depicting harnessed camels that date back to the 3rd millennium BCE. A small bronze statue of a two-humped Bactrian camel with a harness, currently held in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, dates to the early 2nd millennium. This suggests that while they may not have been the primary beast of burden for the masses, they were available to wealthy clan leaders as a sign of prestige and economic advantage. The search for the infamous cities of the plain, Sodom and Gomorrah, has also moved from the realm of legend into the field of scientific investigation. Geological surveys of the Dead Sea region have long noted that the area sits on a major fault line, making it prone to earthquakes and the release of flammable natural gases and bitumen. Recently, excavations at Tal el-Hammam, located just north of the Dead Sea, have uncovered evidence of a catastrophic event at the end of the Middle Bronze Age. Archaeologists found scorched foundations and pottery fragments with a glassy, melted surface, indicating exposure to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, heat comparable to an intense aerial conflagration. This site remained uninhabited for centuries following the disaster, providing a plausible historical anchor for the enduring memory of the cities of the plain. Despite these many parallels, the quest for proof took a sharp turn in the 1970s. A new generation of scholars began to question the golden age of biblical archaeology, pointing out that there is no direct inscription or monument from the 2nd millennium that mentions Abram by name. They argued that the names Abram and Jacob were common West Semitic names, and that the social customs found in the Nuzi tablets were more widespread than previously thought. This school of thought suggests that the stories were actually composed much later, during the Persian period, roughly between 520 and 320 BCE. According to this skeptical view, the narratives were obstacle stories designed to address the political and religious needs of a later community. At a time when Jewish exiles were returning from Babylon to claim their ancestral lands, the figure of Abraham served as a powerful legal and symbolic precedent. By tracing their right to the land back to a common father who had purchased property and received a divine promise, the returning community could establish their identity and authority.
Some historians, such as Mario Liverani, have proposed alternative theories, suggesting that the Abraham of the Bible might be a composite of earlier tribal memories. Liverani points to a 13th century BCE tribe called the Banu Raham, mentioned on a stele of Seti I, as a potential historical kernel for the later Raham or Abrahamic tradition. Yet, the archaeological record continues to offer surprises that challenge a purely late-date composition. The earliest possible external reference to the name Abraham was found on the Bubastite portal at Karnak. This victory monument, erected by Pharaoh Shishak I around 925 BCE, lists towns in the Negev desert that the pharaoh had conquered. One of these locations is referred to as the Fortress of Abraham. The existence of a fortified site bearing his name in the 10th century BCE indicates that the tradition was already well established and significant enough for a foreign conqueror to record it, pushing the tradition back much further than the Persian period. This leaves us with a complex and nuanced picture. While the lack of a direct contemporary signature means that Abram remains a figure of historical plausibility rather than proven history, the Archaeological Quest has succeeded in making his world real. We can now walk through the ruins of the cities he would have seen, read the laws he would have followed, and understand the environmental crises he would have faced. This tangible context transforms him from a distant character into a man of his time, a chieftain navigating a dangerous and changing world. Whether he was a single individual or a figure representing the collective memory of a people's origins, the details of his life are perfectly synchronized with the legal, social, and geographical realities of the Middle Bronze Age.
As we move forward, the focus shifts from the dirt of the earth to the weight of the legacy. The stories of this leader do not end with his travels or the cities he encountered. They culminate in a series of profound ethical and spiritual moments that would define the behavior of billions of people. If the world of Abram is historically plausible, how do we reckon with the deeply challenging and controversial nature of the divine encounters that shaped his path? One such encounter, involving his own son, remains one of the most debated and scrutinized moments in human history. Chapter 3: The Blood, the Binding, and the 10th Test. The life of Abraham was defined by a series of legal and spiritual contracts that transformed a wandering chieftain into a figure of cosmic significance. In the ancient world, these agreements were known as covenants, or brit in Hebrew, and they were far more than simple business deals. They were sacred bonds that established mutual rights and obligations, often sealed with blood and ritual. For Abraham, these covenants were the mechanism through which the unseen Creator anchored his promises to the physical world. They were not merely abstract ideas, but were impressed upon the land, the lineage, and even the very flesh of the patriarch and his descendants. The first of these profound encounters is known as the Covenant of the Pieces, a ritual that feels strange and visceral to modern sensibilities, but was deeply rooted in the legal traditions of the second millennium BCE. After Abraham had rescued his nephew Lot from the 4 kings of the north, he began to experience a period of deep existential doubt. Despite his military victory and his growing wealth, he remained childless. He lamented to the Lord that his steward, Eleazar of Damascus, would likely inherit his entire estate. In response, a vision came to him, instructing him to look toward the night sky and attempt to count the stars. The promise was clear. His offspring would be just as numerous, and they would eventually possess the land from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. To formalize this promise, Abraham was instructed to prepare a specific sacrifice. He took a heifer, a female goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Following the cutting of a covenant custom, he split the larger animals in 2 and laid the halves opposite each other, though he left the birds whole. In a typical ancient Near Eastern treaty, the parties involved would walk between the severed pieces of the animals, effectively saying, "May I become like these animals if I fail to uphold my end of the bargain." It was a self-maledictory oath, a public declaration of the high stakes of the agreement. As the sun began to set, a horror of great darkness fell upon Abraham, and he entered a deep trance-like sleep. In this state, he received a sobering prophecy about the future of his line, learning of the 4 centuries of enslavement his descendants would endure in a foreign land before being released with great wealth. But the most remarkable moment occurred when a smoking firepot and a blazing torch, symbolic representations of the divine presence, passed between the pieces of the animals alone. Abraham did not walk between the pieces. This signified that the covenant was a unilateral promise from the Creator. The burden of fulfilling the oath rested entirely on the divine, a guarantee that the lineage would survive regardless of human failure. This established a foundational theological principle, that Abraham's standing was based on his trust in the promise rather than his own works or rituals. 13 years after the birth of Ishmael, when Abraham was 99 years old, a second covenantal moment occurred that added a permanent physical dimension to this relationship. This was the covenant of circumcision. During this encounter, the patriarch's identity was fundamentally altered through a change of name. Abram, meaning exalted father, became Abraham, meaning father of a multitude. His wife, Sarai, meaning my princess, was renamed Sarah, meaning princess of all. These were not just cosmetic changes. They represented a shift from a localized tribal identity to a global, multi-generational destiny. The Lord commanded Abraham to be perfect or blameless and instituted the rite of circumcision as a sign of the eternal agreement. Every male in his household, including the 13-year-old Ishmael and the servants born in his house or bought with money, was to undergo this procedure. It was a seal in the flesh, a perpetual reminder that this community was set apart for a specific purpose. For Abraham, who was nearly a century old, this was an extraordinary demand. Yet he performed the rite on himself and his entire household on that very day. This act of obedience was the response to the promise that Sarah, despite her advanced age and long-term infertility, would finally bear a son who would be the true heir to the covenant. Shortly after this name change, a major theophany occurred at the Oaks of Mamre that would set the final timeline for the promise. As Abraham sat in the heat of the day at the entrance of his tent, he looked up to see 3 men standing nearby. With the characteristic hospitality of a desert chieftain, he ran to meet them, bowing low and offering them water to wash their feet and a lavish meal of fine flour and choice meat. These visitors were no mere travelers, they were divine messengers, and one spoke with the authority of the Lord. During the meal, the visitor issued a specific prophecy. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son." Sarah, who was listening from behind the tent flap, laughed to herself at the impossibility of the claim, given her age. When the visitor asked why she laughed, Sarah, gripped by a sudden and humanizing fear, denied it, saying, "I did not laugh." The visitor's gentle but firm correction, "No, but you did laugh," underscored the reality that nothing was too difficult for the Creator. This moment of divine humor and human doubt provided the foundation for the child's identity. The birth of this child, Isaac, was the miraculous resolution to decades of waiting. His name, meaning "he laughs," was a poignant reference to that moment at Mamre. When the boy was finally born on the exact anniversary of the covenant of circumcision, Sarah's laughter of disbelief was transformed into a laughter of joy. Abraham held a great feast to celebrate the weaning of his son, but this moment of triumph also brought the simmering tensions within his household to a breaking point. Sarah observed Ishmael mocking the young Isaac and demanded that Hagar and her son be expelled. This was a moment of intense ethical and emotional distress for Abraham. Ishmael was his firstborn, his own seed, and the thought of sending him into the wilderness was agonizing. However, the divine voice instructed Abraham to listen to Sarah, assuring him that Isaac was the one through whom the lineage would be called, but also promising that Ishmael would be made into a great nation because he was also Abraham's son. With a heavy heart, Abraham gave Hagar bread and a skin of water and sent them away.
This separation was the final obstacle in the narrative of Isaac's childhood, clearing the way for the young boy to become the sole focus of Abraham's legacy. It was against this backdrop of hard-won fulfillment that the most controversial and challenging episode of Abraham's life took place, the binding of Isaac, known in Jewish tradition as the Akedah. This event is traditionally regarded as the 10th and final test of Abraham's faith. To understand the climax of the Akedah, one must view it as the conclusion of a lifelong series of trials that began when Abraham was told to leave his home in Ur. Other tests included his survival in the fiery furnace of King Nimrod, the famine that drove him to Egypt, the abduction of Sarah by Pharaoh, and the war against the 4 kings to rescue Lot. Each trial had stripped away a layer of his worldly security, but the 10th test targeted the very heart of the covenant itself. Having finally secured the heir he had waited a lifetime for, Abraham was suddenly commanded to take his beloved son to the land of Moriah and offer him up as a burnt sacrifice. To modern ears, this command is incomprehensible and horrifying, but to understand its historical and ethical weight, we must look at the world in which Abraham lived. In the 2nd millennium BCE, the practice of child sacrifice was a dark and recurring reality among the surrounding pagan cultures. It was often seen as the ultimate proof of devotion to a deity. By issuing this command, the Creator was testing Abraham within the cultural framework he understood. The test was not just about Abraham's love for his son, but about the logic of the covenant. If Isaac were to die, the promise of a vast multitude of descendants would seemingly die with him. Abraham was being asked to choose between the gift, the son and the promise, and the giver. The narrative of the journey to Mount Moriah is marked by a profound stoic silence. Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 servants and Isaac with him. He split the wood for the burnt offering himself, a detail that underscores his direct involvement in every step of the process. For 3 days, they traveled through the rugged landscape toward a location that tradition links to the future site of the temple in Jerusalem. This connection to Mount Moriah adds a cosmic significance to the event. The place where Abraham would offer his son was the same ground where the foundation stone of the world was said to rest, and where the sacrificial system of the future nation would eventually be centered. As they climbed the mountain, Isaac carried the wood for his own sacrifice, while Abraham carried the fire and the knife. In one of the most heart-wrenching dialogues in ancient literature, the boy looked at his father and asked, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham's reply was a masterpiece of faith and ambiguity. God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. Upon reaching the summit, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood. He then bound Isaac and laid him upon the altar. The age of Isaac during this trial is a subject of significant traditional debate. While often depicted as a child in art, many sources suggest he was a young man of 15, while Jewish midrashic tradition suggests he was as old as 37. If Isaac was indeed a grown man, his cooperation in being bound suggests a shared commitment to the trial and a strength that could have easily resisted his aged father. Just as Abraham raised the knife, a voice from the heavens shouted his name twice, telling him to stop. "Lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him, for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me." Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a nearby thicket by its horns. He sacrificed the ram in place of his son, naming the location Jehovah-Jireh, which means the Lord will provide. This event served as a radical break from the surrounding cultures. It was a divine declaration that while total devotion was required, the actual sacrifice of human life was not. It replaced the practice of child sacrifice with the concept of substitutionary sacrifice, a shift that would have profound implications for the development of religious ethics. Because Abraham had demonstrated a willingness to surrender even the most precious part of his life, the covenant was reaffirmed with even greater intensity.
He was promised that his descendants would possess the gates of their enemies, and that through his offspring all the nations of the earth would be blessed. This moment of extreme trial solidified Abraham's role as the Hebrew, the one who had crossed over from the old world of paganism into a new reality of faith. He was now the father of the faithful, a man whose trust in an unseen power was capable of overriding even the most basic human instincts. However, the resolution of this crisis did not mean the end of Abraham's challenges. The high-altitude drama of Mount Moriah soon gave way to the quiet, heavy reality of mortality. The patriarch, who had navigated famines, wars, and divine tests, was about to face a more personal loss that would force him to secure his legacy in a different way. Sarah, the woman who had laughed at the promise and then lived to see it fulfilled, died at the age of 127. Her death would lead Abraham into a new kind of negotiation, one that would involve the legal purchase of land and the establishment of a permanent anchor for his family in the soil of Canaan. This next phase of his life would raise new questions about the intersection of faith, property, and the political sensitivities of a land that was promised but not yet fully possessed.
Chapter 4: The Purchase of Machpelah and the Hebron Legacy.
The landscape of the Judean highlands is a rugged expanse of limestone hills and ancient olive groves, a place where the wind carries the weight of millennia. It was here, in a city known to the ancients as Kirjath Arba and to us as Hebron, that the narrative of Abraham shifted from the epic of wandering and divine tests to the somber reality of mortality and the legalities of the earth. After a lifetime of living in tents and moving according to the seasons, Abraham faced a crisis that required him to do something he had never done before. He had to own a piece of the land he had been promised. This transition began with the death of Sarah, his lifelong companion and the mother of his heir. Sarah died at the age of 127. In the vast genealogical records of the ancient world, she holds a unique distinction. She is the only woman whose specific age at the time of death is recorded in the text. Her passing was not just a personal loss for Abraham, but a moment of profound vulnerability for his entire household. Continuing their life as sojourners established in earlier years, they had built altars and dug wells, but they had never claimed legal ownership of the soil. As Abraham stood up from mourning his wife, he realized that he could not bury her as a wanderer. He needed a permanent anchor, a site that would belong to his lineage by law and by deed, ensuring that her remains, and eventually his own, would not be disturbed by the shifting political alliances of the local tribes.
The negotiation that followed is one of the most detailed legal dramas preserved from the ancient Near East. Abraham approached the local leaders, the Hittites, who controlled the region of Hebron. While the biblical text identifies these people as Hittites, they likely represented the broader Amorite or Habiru populations discussed in earlier chapters, living within the established city-states of the Middle Bronze Age. Abraham stood before them at the city gate, which served as the public square and the court of law. His request was humble but firm. He asked for a place among them to bury his dead. The dialogue that ensued was a master class in ancient social etiquette and high-stakes bargaining. The local leaders, recognizing Abraham as a powerful and respected chieftain, a prince of God among them, offered him the choice of any of their finest sepulchres for free. However, Abraham knew the difference between a gift and a legal title. In the volatile world of tribal Canaan, a gift could be revoked or disputed by the next generation. To secure his legacy, he needed a transaction that was witnessed, recorded, and paid for in full. He specifically set his sights on a piece of property owned by a man named Ephron, the son of Zohar. This property included a field and a cave located at the edge of it, known as the Cave of Machpelah. Abraham's interest in this specific site was not accidental or merely convenient.
Tradition suggests he specifically sought the cave of Machpelah because he believed it held the remains of Adam and Eve, the first humans. This knowledge added a deeper layer to his intent. He was not just buying a family plot, but claiming a site of cosmic and ancestral significance. Abraham asked the leaders to intercede with Ephron on his behalf. When Ephron appeared, he followed the customary hospitality of the time, offering to give the field and the cave to Abraham as a gesture of goodwill. But Abraham was insistent. He bowed before the people of the land and stated clearly that he wished to pay the full price for the property. Ephron then named a price that was staggering for the time, 400 shekels of silver. To put this in perspective, this was a princely sum, far exceeding the typical value of a small field and a cave. It was a price that signaled Ephron's awareness of Abraham's wealth and his own leverage in the negotiation. Without a moment's hesitation or a single attempt to haggle, Abraham weighed out the silver in the sight of all the witnesses at the gate. This was raw silver, weighed against standard stones. The payment of 400 shekels was a calculated legal maneuver. By paying an exorbitant price in public, Abraham ensured the title was ironclad, preventing any future claim that the land was a mere gift that could be rescinded by Ephron's heirs. The text emphasizes that the field, the cave within it, and all the trees that were on the property were made sure to Abraham as a possession. This was the first piece of the promised land that Abraham actually owned. It was a small, quiet plot of earth purchased with silver, yet it represented the physical fulfillment of a divine promise that had previously existed only in the realm of faith.
Abraham buried Sarah in the cave, and in doing so, he established Hebron as the spiritual and ancestral heart of his family. The cave of Machpelah became more than just a tomb. It became a landmark of identity. Over the centuries, this site would grow into one of the most significant and sensitive locations on the planet. Today, the cave is encased within a massive, fortress-like structure characterized by enormous stone blocks, some of which are several feet long. This architectural marvel is a masterpiece of Herodian masonry, featuring the same distinct pilasters and towering walls found in the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The use of these massive stones creates a sense of awe and permanence that reflects the gravity of the figures buried within. The mystery of the cave is compounded by the fact that the actual burial chambers lie deep beneath the floor of the current structure, and for centuries access to them has been strictly limited or entirely forbidden due to religious sensitivities. Tradition holds that the cave serves as the final resting place not only for Sarah and Abraham, but also for their son Isaac and his wife Rebekah, and their grandson Jacob and his wife Leah. The belief that the cave is the burial site of Adam and Eve adds a layer of cosmic significance to the site, viewing it as a portal between the mundane world and the ancestral past. As Abraham entered his final years, his life continued to reflect the theme of being a father of many nations. After the death of Sarah and the marriage of Isaac to Rebekah, Abraham took another wife, a woman named Keturah. This part of his biography is crucial to understanding the sheer scale of his biological legacy. With Keturah, Abraham fathered 6 more sons: Zimran, Jokshan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. These sons would go on to become the ancestors of various tribes and peoples who inhabited the regions to the east and south of Canaan. The Midianites, in particular, would play a major role in the later history of the region. Even as his family expanded, Abraham remained focused on the integrity of the covenant he had established through Isaac. To prevent future conflict among his many children, he followed a strategy that was both pragmatic and poignant. He gave all that he had to Isaac, the son of the promise. To the sons of his concubines and his second wife, he gave gifts and sent them away toward the east, ensuring that Isaac would have the space and the resources to flourish in the land of Canaan without the pressure of sibling rivalry. Abraham died at the age of 175, a lifespan that the narrative describes as a good old age, full of years. His death brought about a remarkable and symbolic moment of reconciliation.
Isaac and Ishmael, the two sons who had been separated by household strife and the harsh realities of the wilderness years earlier, came together to bury their father. They met at the cave of Machpelah, the very plot of land Abraham had purchased for Sarah. This image of the two brothers, the ancestor of the Israelites and the ancestor of the Arab peoples, standing side by side to lay their father to rest, is one of the most powerful scenes of unity in ancient literature. It suggests that despite the divisions and the different paths their lives had taken, the bond of their common father remained an unbreakable thread. The burial of Abraham next to Sarah in the cave marked the end of the patriarchal era's first great chapter, but it also initiated a long history of political and religious sensitivity surrounding the site. Because Abraham is revered as a foundational figure in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the Cave of the Patriarchs has become a focal point for all three faiths. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern era, the structure over the cave has seen various incarnations. It has been a synagogue, a Byzantine church, a Crusader cathedral, and a mosque. Each layer of history has left its mark on the stones, and each community has sought to claim a connection to the man buried below.
This shared reverence has, unfortunately, often led to intense friction. The city of Hebron itself has become a microcosm of the broader tensions in the region, where the struggle over land and legacy is played out in the shadow of the ancient walls. The political sensitivities of the site are rooted in the very nature of Abraham's purchase. By buying the land with silver, Abraham moved the promise of the land from the theological to the legal. This has led to centuries of debate over the rights of his various descendants. For the Jewish people, the purchase of Machpelah is cited as a historical and legal justification for their presence in Hebron. For the Muslim community, the long history of Islamic worship at the site and Abraham's role as a precursor to the Prophet Muhammad establish a deep and enduring claim. The physical layout of the structure today reflects these sensitivities. The interior is divided into sections for Jewish and Muslim prayer, a pragmatic arrangement that attempts to manage the competing needs of the two communities. The cenotaphs, the ornamental monuments that mark the positions of the graves below, are draped in colorful cloths and are visited by thousands of pilgrims every year. Yet, the air within the halls is often thick with the awareness of the conflict that exists just outside the doors. The site is a place of intense devotion, but also a place of heavy security and watchful eyes. The mystery of what lies within the actual cave remains one of the great lures for archaeologists and historians. Over the centuries, there have been a few rare accounts of individuals who managed to descend into the underground chambers. These stories describe narrow passages, circular rooms, and ancient masonry that predates the visible structure. In the late 1960s and again in the early 1980s, brief and clandestine explorations reported finding bones and pottery fragments that could date back to the Bronze Age, the very time of the patriarchs. However, the immense religious and political pressure surrounding the site makes a systematic scientific excavation almost impossible. The cave remains a sanctuary that guards its secrets, a silent witness to the life of the man who bought it. Abraham's decision to purchase the cave of Machpelah was his final act of faith. He did not live to see his descendants become a great nation, nor did he see them possess the entire land of Canaan. He died owning only a single field and a cave. But that small plot of earth was enough to change the world. It transformed the promise of God into a physical reality and provided a center of gravity for his children that has lasted for 4,000 years. The site stands as a testament to the idea that the most enduring legacies are often anchored in the most quiet and somber of places. As we look at the massive stones of Hebron and the complex web of history they represent, we are reminded that Abraham's life was not just a series of events in the distant past. It was the starting point for a narrative that continues to unfold in the present day. The transition from a single family to a global phenomenon raises a final, critical question. How did the image of this wandering shepherd evolve to become the unifying and dividing figure for billions of people across the globe?
Chapter 5: The Father of Nations and the Architect of Faith.
The transformation of a single wandering chieftain into the spiritual and biological anchor for billions of people is one of the most remarkable phenomena in human history. To understand the legacy of Abraham, we must look at how his identity shifted from a localized figure of the Middle Bronze Age to a global archetype whose name is invoked in daily rituals across every continent. This legacy is built on the foundation of a name change that signaled his transition from a tribal leader to a universal progenitor, a father of a multitude whose influence would eventually be categorized under the modern label of the Abrahamic religions. This term, while a relatively recent scholarly and diplomatic tool used to bridge the three great monotheistic faiths, underscores the patriarch's role as the primary lens through which half the world's population views the divine. In the Jewish tradition, Abraham is revered as Avraham Avinu, or our father Abraham. This title signifies a dual role as both the biological ancestor of the Jewish people and the spiritual founder of Judaism. He is the first Jew, the man who established a unique covenantal relationship with the Creator that is viewed as a formal contract or brit. For the Jewish community, the legacy of Abraham is a living reality, experienced through the weekly cycle of Torah readings. His life is chronicled in specific portions known as parashat, including Lech Lecha, Vayera, Chaye Sarah, and Toledot. These readings ensure that his journey remains a contemporary guide for ethical conduct and communal identity. A unique theological legacy within Judaism, often overshadowed by the somber themes of sacrifice, is what some scholars call the laughter theology. When Sarah gave birth to Isaac, she famously declared that God had made laughter for her. By naming God the laughter maker, Sarah introduced a dimension of joy and divine humor into the legacy of the patriarch. This perspective suggests that the divine relationship is not solely defined by gravity and trial, but also by the gift of the impossible becoming a source of communal delight. It is a legacy of resilience where the figure of Abraham serves as a model of virtue, reminding the nation that their future often relies on a thread of the miraculous, a theme established by the long-awaited arrival of his heir. In Christianity, the legacy of Abraham takes on a universal spiritual dimension. While the New Testament acknowledges him as a physical forebear of Jesus, its primary focus is on Abraham as the spiritual ancestor of all believers. This interpretation was championed by Paul the Apostle, who taught that Abraham's faith was the defining characteristic of his life, credited to him as righteousness long before the institution of ritual law. By emphasizing trust over ceremony, Christianity opened the door for the Gentile world to claim Abraham as their own. This spiritual lineage is cemented in the very heart of Christian worship. In the Roman canon of the Mass, the oldest Eucharistic prayer of the Western Church, Abraham is explicitly named as our Father in faith. This liturgical presence ensures that his name is invoked daily in cathedrals and small chapels alike, linking the modern believer to the ancient wanderer. Furthermore, the Christian interpretation of the patriarch's life focuses heavily on the theological implications of his greatest trial. The willingness to offer his son is viewed not merely as a test of obedience, but as a profound type or foreshadowing of the central event of the Christian faith, the sacrifice of the Son of God. In this view, the events on the mountain are a direct precursor to the New Testament narrative, positioning Abraham as the architect of a faith that bridges the ancient laws of the Middle East with a global community of believers. In Islam, the figure of Ibrahim is a central link in the chain of prophets that began with Adam and culminated in the prophet Muhammad. He is described as a Hanif, a person of pure monotheism who instinctively recognized the oneness of God. The Islamic legacy of Ibrahim is deeply intertwined with the sacred geography of Mecca and the rebuilding of the Kaaba. His presence is not merely historical but liturgical. In the 5 daily prayers performed by Muslims worldwide, a specific blessing known as the Salawat is recited, asking God to bless the Prophet Muhammad and his family, just as he blessed Ibrahim and his family. This constant invocation makes Ibrahim a living part of the Muslim consciousness. Within the Sufi tradition, the mystical dimension of Islam, Ibrahim is celebrated as a model of extraordinary generosity. He is often referred to as the Father of Guests, a title reflecting his legendary hospitality at the Oaks of Mamre. In Sufism, his willingness to serve others is seen as an extension of his submission to God. This adds a dimension to his Islamic legacy that goes beyond the standard narrative of surrender. He is the archetype of the friend of God, Khalilullah, whose heart is open to both the divine and the stranger. The rituals of the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, serve as a living reenactment of this legacy. Pilgrims run between the hills of Safa and Marwa and perform the symbolic stoning of the devil, turning the ancient trials of Ibrahim's family into a physical experience of faith for millions of people each year. The breadth of Abraham's biological legacy extends far beyond these 3 major faiths. The biblical record and historical traditions list a vast array of nations and tribes that trace their origins back to him. Through Isaac and Jacob, he is the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Through Ishmael, he is the progenitor of the Arab world. Through his second wife, Keturah, he fathered numerous other tribes who populated the regions to the east and south of Canaan, as detailed in the genealogical records of the ancient Near East. This extensive family tree illustrates why he is considered a pivotal and strategic figure in human history, a man whose DNA and traditions were woven into the fabric of the entire region.
Beyond the big 3 religions, Abraham is also a foundational figure in the Baha'i faith and the Druze faith. In the Baha'i tradition, he is recognized as a manifestation of God, a divine messenger who set in motion a process of spiritual evolution. For the Druze, he is revered as a key spokesman prophet in the transmission of divine wisdom. This universal recognition across such diverse belief systems suggests that the themes of his life, posterity, land, and the search for a single truth, resonate with a fundamental human need for identity and purpose. However, the very fact that so many groups claim Abraham as their exclusive father has led to his legacy being a source of deep and lasting division. This friction is most evident in the competing narratives of the Great Sacrifice. While the Jewish and Christian traditions are adamant that Isaac was the son on the altar, the majority of Islamic scholarship holds that it was Ishmael. This is not a minor detail of storytelling. It is a dispute over which lineage holds the primary spiritual and legal standing. It is a conflict over the birthright and the inheritance of the divine promise, with profound real-world consequences for the modern political landscape.
The legacy of Abraham is also a legacy of land. The promise that his descendants would possess the land of Canaan has been used for centuries to justify competing claims to the same territory. For the Jewish people, the purchase of the cave of Machpelah in Hebron provides a historical and religious mandate for their presence. For the Muslim community, the long history of Ibrahim's role in establishing the holy sites of Mecca and Jerusalem creates an equally powerful claim. The city of Hebron, where the patriarch is buried, has become a microcosm of this struggle, a place where the shared reverence for a common father often leads to intense confrontation. In recent decades, there has been a conscious effort to reclaim the unifying potential of the patriarch. Movements seeking interfaith dialogue often use the image of Isaac and Ishmael standing together at their father's grave, a scene that serves as a powerful callback symbol for the possibility of peace. These initiatives emphasize shared values of hospitality and justice, hoping that if Jews, Christians, and Muslims can recognize themselves as members of one extended family, they might find a path toward reconciliation.
Yet even these well-intentioned efforts face the reality that the figure of Abraham is not a blank slate. He is a character defined by specific covenants and exclusive promises that are interpreted differently by each tradition. To the Jewish people, he is the biological root. To the Christian, he is the spiritual prototype. To the Muslim, he is the model of total submission. Each group views him through a different theological lens, and these lenses are often incompatible. The legacy of Abraham is therefore a complex tapestry of shared heritage and exclusive claims, a story that provides a sense of belonging to billions while simultaneously highlighting the boundaries that set them apart. The story of the historical Abraham, which began with a radical intellectual break from the idols of Mesopotamia, has evolved into a global narrative that shapes the laws, ethics, and identities of the modern world. He introduced the idea that the human condition is not a cycle of pleasing a pantheon of fickle gods, but a journey of faith toward a single higher purpose. As we look back at the life of this wandering shepherd, we are left with a fundamental question that continues to echo through the halls of mosques, synagogues, and churches. If Abraham is indeed the common father of so many warring factions, is his legacy destined to remain a source of division? Or can the memory of his original quest for a single truth finally provide the key to a shared future? The answer to that question may determine the path of human history for the next 4,000 years.
The story of Abraham is more than an ancient biography. It is the spiritual blueprint for half the world's population. From the streets of Ur to the heights of Mount Moriah, he navigated a world of shifting sands and divine promises, transforming from a wandering chieftain into the father of nations. While archaeology provides a plausible historical backdrop, his true impact lies in the radical shift toward monotheism and the enduring covenants he forged. Today, his legacy remains a complex tapestry of shared heritage and deep-seated division, anchoring the faith of billions while fueling modern geopolitical tensions. Whether viewed as a biological ancestor or a spiritual prototype, Abraham's original quest for a single truth continues to challenge us. Can this common father ultimately bridge the very divisions his descendants have created? Thank you for listening to this exploration of the historical Abraham.